But I want to react to this movie. Well, it's not really a reaction, it's a review. I figured I'm going to go ahead and do this review for Civil War. I went to go see Civil War on its debut week. I could have gone to see it earlier, but decided to go see it on the premiere week. And not going to lie, it was a fantastic, fantastic film. Now, I do want to discuss some criticisms that many people had with this film, because I've read through some, I've watched some reviews. I completely understand where people are coming from with their critiques, but in general, I just don't think that they're correct. I don't think that they're necessarily correct. But first, I want to talk about what I liked about this movie. First of all, I think that the choice of characters was fine. These characters were not necessarily the most complex characters in the world, but they felt like real people. And it felt relatively realistic, right? Whenever there's some sort of conflict, there are always going to be cameramen running into the danger. Now, this movie is basically about journalists, right? So I'm actually not going to explain the premise, 'cause I'm sure you guys have heard the premise already. But, these are photojournalists. These are not your regular, ordinary journalists. So many people heard that the movie was about journalists in an American Civil War, and they were like, oh, well, I hate journalists. Well, the journalists that you hate are probably people like Tucker Carlson or Don Lemon, different ends of the political spectrum, folks like that who can be partisan, extremely opinionated. They don't even break stories. They just do spin on current events, and they spout their opinions. That's not real journalism. These folks, I think, are real journalists, and they have done real journalism in the past, but that's not what they're doing now. What they're doing now is punditry, not journalism. Journalists are the ones who break stories. They do investigations. They do research. And they share information that no one yet has. And these photojournalists, they go into dangerous parts of the world. They take pictures and they share them online to whatever. Like, it could be AP News. It could be Getty. These folks are portrayed to be generally Reuters reporters. I think one is supposed to be an employee for the New York Times. These are the types of journalists where, if you remember during the Summer of Love, there were all of those actually beautiful and gorgeous images coming out of the Antifa and Black Lives Matter protests. Those were taken by photojournalists, the type of journalists who were featured in this film. And so I appreciated that they showed real journalists and real journalism. I thought that was nice. But that's not the only thing I liked about the movie. One thing I liked about the movie, too, is that it felt extremely realistic in its portrayal of what a civil war in the United States might look like. Now, to be fair, it wasn't hyper realistic. I think in the third act, especially, some things weren't, the most realistic in the world, to the point where, I brought a couple friends with me and we both were looking at each other like, that's not exactly how that would go down. So it's not hyper realistic. I think part of it is to make it seem like, for the viewer, that toppling the White House and taking over the Oval Office is easier than it actually is, because if let's be honest, right? Some people are probably going to look at this movie and be like, "Yeah, we are the Western forces. Let's go. We should do this in America." Well, if they copy the blueprint that was left behind by this movie, they will get blown to smithereens. They will get destroyed. Absolutely. Sandblasted. But is sandblasted the right word? I don't know. They would get destroyed, blown up into smithereens. They would lose. They would have no shot at success. So I do understand from a responsibility perspective why they chose to make certain choices when it comes to the realism in that final third act. But this movie was great. Now, one qualm that many people had with the movie is that it was not what it was advertised as. I think Altiori on YouTube, probably had the most notoriously transparent take when it came to this. She literally said, I didn't like the trailer. I liked the trailer. I went to see the movie. The movie was nothing like the trailer. Therefore, the movie was bad. I don't think that's a fair take at all. That doesn't make any sense. A trailer cannot make a movie bad. Now, a trailer can make you disappointed when you go see a movie, but if you go see a movie and it's not what the trailer advertised, that doesn't mean the trailer is bad. Now, you may think that it's bad at first glance, and maybe she made the video out of like a knee-jerk reaction, because I actually remember there was a case earlier this week, actually it was yesterday, where I saw like this little like brown thing on like a paper towel someone had like left behind like in the kitchen. It was like one of those things where you could tell someone was cooking and they just left some food behind because they didn't really care about it. So I was like, oh, this looks like a brownie. I'm gonna go and take a bite out of this. And I tasted it. I'm like, brother, ew. What is this? I take it out of my mouth. I take a closer look, because it does not taste like a brownie. It's like weird. It's like salty. It's like crunchy. I take a look at it. It's a burnt piece of bacon. I put it back in my mouth and I'm like, you know what? This is actually pretty good. I suspect that this is what happened to Altieri and a lot of other people who went to the theaters. They saw the trailer with all these reviews saying it's the best combat movie. Like all of this stuff, like saying like, oh, this is the stuff that IMAX was built for, and all these explosions. And they were thinking that the whole movie would be this cartoonish, actiony, romanticized Civil War film with all of these coordinated army battle scenes with like the red and the blue charging at each other on a battlefield. And they were all sad when that's not what they got. I think one thing that's kind of funny is that kind of like the whole point of the movie, according to Alex Garland, is that we don't want a civil war. We don't want to see that type of crazy, violent conflict. And so I think that he, to a certain degree, must be disappointed that so many people were like, man, you know what? I wish there was more bloodshed. I wish we saw more Americans dying. Isn't it sad that we didn't get more action scenes? He's got to be a little bit upset about that. But yes, I heard some other people also saying that the movie had nothing to say except for war is bad. And, you know, I kind of understand where they're coming from, because it did pretty much just say war is bad. It didn't really have a propagandistic message, which I appreciated, although some people clearly didn't. There were some people who were like, why isn't this vilifying Trumpsters? Why is this vilifying Republicans? Which alone is kind of silly. But I think that the point of it is not just necessarily to say that war is bad, but to explain why. So we see shots of, dudes being lit on fire. We see looters tortured as they're hung from their necks. We're seeing people getting shot at for no reason just because they're driving in a certain area. We're seeing people who are forced into, pushing, well, not forced, but they're starving and they're dehydrated due to low resources because the supply chain is broken, to the point where they're rioting and fighting police. These are not things that we want, but these are the types of things that we would see if there was some sort of civil war in America. And this is to avoid the more, I guess, visceral and bloody incidents that some people were saying should have been in the movie, where you would have just like brother turning on brother, fighting each other, citizens shooting up their neighbors. Now, to be clear, I don't think that a civil war would entirely be just that. And also, to be entirely fair, I think that this intentionally showed the end of the conflict, right? I think that the types of combative neighbors to shoot each other at this point, they would have all been dead, right? Or the ones who would have won those conflicts just like killed the neighbors, and that was it at this point. So I understand why we didn't see those types of conflicts, because once the civilians kind of like kill each other off, then all you have left are or at least the ones who like to fight. Once they're all killed off, basically, then the only people that we have left are the military types, right? The Western forces, right? The loyalist states or whatever, the other factions, more militarized, coordinated groups. That makes a lot of sense. To be honest, I think when it comes to the messaging, though, there's one downside to this film, and I hope that this is not the takeaway that some people have from this movie, but it portrays war as such a terrible and horrifying and harrowing thing that I suspect that some people would say that would take away from this movie that there's not anything worth fighting for, right? War is bad, fighting is bad, and therefore we should not fight, we should not have war, ever. That's the wrong take to have. Because if you look at the plot of the movie, this is all basically instigated by a despotic aristocratic president. I guess, is aristocratic the right word? An authoritarian fascist president who has decided to take on a third term, bomb American citizens, do all types of things that are extremely authoritarian and just oppress the civilians. And those are the actions that pushed the country to the brink. Like, take a third term is like it. Dunzo. You can't do that. It's against the Constitution. Yet the dude decided to tear apart the Constitution anyways. So, to a degree, the war is his fault because he pushed the country to this point. He decided to become a fascist. And, it makes sense that the dude had to be removed, right? Makes sense. Hopefully you would think that there'd be more peaceful ways to do that than by killing them. But I can completely understand, like, the Western forces cause, right? This guy must be deposed. But I think that not everyone's going to look at this movie with the correct nuance, especially when we're already seeing, obviously, some extremely limited media literacy from many people who watched the film, who thought it was dumb, slow, boring, didn't have anything to say at all. So I think there is some danger that that's going to be an interpretation of the film. One thing I'll say about what it was like to watch the movie, just as I bring this review to a close, because the things that really stuck out to me are some of the reasons why I liked the movie the most. Just the opening. There were some shots from like Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests, violent ones, like the Summer of Love, all that stuff. And I realized why this was familiar to me because it was like listed in the credits that a lot of the footage came from Andy Ngo. And I remember watching like almost every single violent protest footage, video footage that Andy Ngo was posting on Twitter, which is now called X. But I was watching footage from like in the opening sequence, there's like this footage from these protests. And I was watching it and I'm like, I literally can't tell if this is real or if this is from the movie. And that alone was just like, oh, wow. But then I remember seeing slight like segments from clips that I remember watching when it happened. And I was like, oh, this is like actually real. That was quite a moment, to see, in there. So that was one thing where I was like, wow, this is mirroring real life. Another thing that reminded me a couple moments that stuck out. One was the moment where I'm sure you've seen in the trailer, where the journalists, they go into the store in I think West Virginia, clearly a low value target because there's been no signs of conflict, of war, or anything. Everything's super peaceful. People are just going about their normal days, the regular lives. They're in this downtown area. They go to the store. Oh, hold on. Let me see here. What's this? Oh, yeah. They go to the store. And there's this person who is just like running a shop and being like, hey, you want to buy something? And they're like, hey, you do know that there's like a civil war happening, right? And she's like, oh, yeah, nah, I want to stay out of it. Seems like it's for the best. Just watching the news. I don't want to get involved in all that stuff. It reminded me of a moment where, and this is not to necessarily put anyone on blast. I'm just saying that it felt familiar. It reminded me of a time during the Black Lives Matter, like Summer of Love protests. I was watching the news. I think it was woke.net at the time. They were really good at this on Twitch. They were going live, showing all these different live feeds from all of these different violent protests. I was following the news of some of the protests, and I kind of look at one of them, and I'm like, they're actually like 30, 45 minutes away from our house, from where we live. And they're actually like busting windows in suburban homes and doing these things. They're being violent. Seems a little bit dangerous. Seems like it might not be great, if they get a little bit closer, perhaps. So I go and tell my parents about this because they own the place. And they're like, nah, nothing will ever happen. It'll be fine. They won't come near our house. It turns out that they didn't. But that same sort of sentiment was expressed in this film. And I was like, because in the moment when that happened, right, in real life, I was like, I mean, we don't necessarily know for sure that nothing is going to happen necessarily, right? Nothing probably will happen, but it doesn't mean that we can't like watch out and, keep an eye out on the window or at least track the protests to see if they do get any closer. But they weren't concerned. I was concerned a little bit, not terribly, but a little bit. And kind of like the journalists, I was a little bit confused as to why, when hearing news about this type of thing, you would not necessarily, kind of like be more on alert about what could potentially happen. So I thought that was kind of interesting because those types of people do exist on both sides. The people who would be more worried about a violent thing happening to them and being more on the lookout, but also the types of people who are more lackadaisical, who feel like nothing's ever going to happen and they just like to take things more easy. But by the way, the people who know me in real life, they know that I'm an easygoing person. I just do like keeping an eye out for potential threats and things of that nature. That's why I follow the news. That's one reason why I decided to do that. Another moment that stood out to me as something that just felt like it was ripped from the pages of real life was the third act. And I guess I should probably put up some text over here because we're getting into some spoiler territories here. Even though I know that I've shared some slight spoilers already, this is kind of a major spoiler here. In the third act, it all involves the journalists finding and then tagging along the Western forces as they march into the Capitol, take over the White House, and then basically they kill the president. That whole march into DC with all of the tanks and stuff really, really reminded me of the march on Moscow that Prigozhin did in Russia. And at that point, many people were calling that a civil war. And it felt like he could have taken over the Kremlin if he wanted to. He could have, taken over the official government building. He actually did take over some official government buildings during that march. And I was like, man, because I remember, I think there was actually a stream of it where I was covering this story live, looking at all the footage of this happening, seeing tanks just driving next to like gas stations in the middle of the road. And I was like, man, imagine if something like this happened in America. And now I'm watching the Civil War movie and I'm seeing a tank driving in the middle of a residential area, like past a parking garage in DC. And I'm like, this felt like me looking at an actual Civil War thing being like, whoa, what if this happened? And it was literally the same thing. To me, I was just like, wow, seems like I came straight from real life. But all that to say, this movie is not perfect. Officially, my wife said the movie's boring. It's not boring. It is a thriller drama. It's not a cartoonish action film. So, sorry if it's not romanticizing a war between Americans where Americans are just killing each other. Too bad. Sorry. Sorry that it will not slake your bloodlust. But I think one of the biggest problems with the movie is actually its visual fidelity. Now, one thing to note about this film is that even though it's showing in IMAX and it was shot in an IMAX resolution, the camera that was used for this film was not an official IMAX camera. And you can kind of tell. There were many shots that felt like, while they were good shots, and the quality wasn't bad, it felt like it was taken on like the highest quality phone possible and just, tweaked with some really good color grading. It didn't look like anything crazy. To some degrees that made it feel more real because, when you take a video with your phone, I think honestly, if you're looking at a video, if you took it with your phone, it looks the most real, right? Versus if you're taking with some like, red digital camera or something with a crazy parallax and, narrow like focus or whatever. What's it called? Narrow depth of field. It kind of looks too cinematic to be real. That's why, when people use narrow depth of field in live football broadcasts, it kind of fell off to some people. So, watching it, and I kind of noticed like the resolution wasn't the highest. I was like, the visual fidelity on this is kind of lacking. But honestly, that's a minor gripe because at the end of the day, it was a good film. A movie is a little bit more than the pixels that you see on the screen, right? It's about the story, and the story I think was fantastic. I kind of wish there was a little bit more character progression of all the characters, but at the end of the day, it's more about like a realistic depiction of what a Civil War in America might be like and what it might be like to kind of witness everything happening on the front lines because some people complained, like, why are they not showing perspective from civilians, right? Because if you're a civilian, you know, you would be like under threat, it would be more exciting and more thrilling. But by tagging along with journalists, you get a perspective that you wouldn't see as a civilian. You know, hey, if a civil war is coming to America, we're already going to experience whatever it's going to be like. But are we going to know what it's going to be like to actually be on the front lines with all these soldiers? What it's going to be like to tag along with these people as they march into the Capitol? No, we're not. So this made for a unique look into what it'd be like in a Civil War conflict from a very unique perspective. So I thought it was a good movie. I gave it a 9 out of 10. I'm kind of wavering on that. I'm not sure if I'm going to push it down to an 8 out of 10. I know I like it in 9 out of 10 amounts. I have to think about it a little bit more to determine whether or not I'm going to reduce my my rating. But I am working on my top 10 list of movies for 2024. And I don't think it's going to drop any, even if it goes from, you know, a 9 to an 8. Because I don't think it was better than any of the other 9 out of 10 movies that I've seen this year. So if you haven't seen this movie, go watch it. I know what the trailers say this movie's going to be like, but I don't care. The movie's still good, regardless of the trailers. Go check it out. The movie's fire. The movie's good. You know, if you can stand some like harrowingly tense moments that involve like combat and war, and if you can handle loud gunshots, then you're set. You're good. I had a friend who oversold how terrifying this movie would be. Like, I've seen Sound of Freedom and 13 Hours, Secret Soldiers of Benghazi. Both those movies were harder to watch than Civil War. So don't let people scare you into not seeing this movie. I think this movie is fantastic. This movie is good. It's not necessarily a must watch, but I think it's worth watching, especially if you have been hankering and wishing for a Civil War.